Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Perry Ekimai channel, where we are going through the LDS Truth Claim series. Before we begin, just a quick note on the structure of this episode. To this point so far, we have been following the LDS Truth Claim series chapter by chapter. In this episode on David Whitmer, it ends abruptly as McDonald then proceeds to a discussion about Joseph Smith's alleged powers of hypnosis. He then concludes his discussion on Joseph's alleged powers of hypnosis by returning to his arguments about David Whitmer. And so since this series is following McDonald's and it's somewhat subject to the formatting of his series, this episode is going to be kind of a one-parter covering two parts of his, both the David Whitmer episode and the hypnosis episode, in order to kind of give a complete coverage of what's discussed. So thus far, we have discussed the informal witnesses to the golden plates and two of the three witnesses. Martin Harris is arguably the most problematic of the three witnesses, whereas Cowdery is as arguably the most beneficial of the three witnesses for the faithful case. David Whitmer occupies the space that's in between, as his many statements give greatest breadth of details about the experience of any witness to the golden plates, but that also allows for the greatest room for sort of critical scrutiny. As with Harris and Cowdery, McDonald starts his discussion by defending Whitmer's impeachability on the basis of bias, character, and competence. As McDonald notes, David Whitmer was one of the earliest people involved in the Mormonism movement. Joseph Smith, in the work of translation, found their residence in the Whitmer home for much of the culminating period of the work. All of the 8 witnesses and 2 of the 3 witnesses were connected to either the Smiths or the Whitmers by blood or by marriage. David Whitmer had a prominent role in the early church, and he was at the heart of the schism that happened after the collapse of the Kirtland Anti-Banking Society. In the wake of Joseph's death at Carthage, Whitmer became the head of the Whitmerite sect, and his writings remain influential in the Temple Lock sect to this day. McDonald argues that Whitmer cannot be impeached for bias along the same lines that he argued for Harris and Cowdery, namely that he had no reason to continue a conspiracy with Smith, and that he had adverse life experiences that may have incentivized revealing the conspiracy. However, Whitmer provides an interesting case study in exactly why, despite having a falling out with Joseph Smith, any of the 3 witnesses may not have had cause to actually reveal the conspiracy. It was Whitmer, after all, who was ultimately ordained to a position of prominence among a body of Mormons for some time. It is Whitmer whose writings remain influential among a sect of Mormonism to this very day. So in terms of character, McDonald lays out a number of claims from those who knew David Whitmer that attest to his upstanding and amiable demeanor. Whitmer was understood to be an honest and upright man. It is noteworthy that McDonald references many people who could testify of Whitmer's character, but these same people did not accept as true Whitmer's statements about the plates. Perhaps this can be an indicator of how a person's character is an inadequate variable for considering the truth of an extraordinary claim. Additionally, in defense of Whitmer's character, though perhaps also in defense of Whitmer's consistency, McDonald shares statements describing an event wherein Whitmer and a few other prominent Mormons were held at gunpoint by a mob, threatened with death unless they renounced their testimonies of the Book of Mormon, but were let go when David Whitmer gave a powerful and stirring testimony of the same. There is a brief account of the event given by John P. Green, and a couple of later statements made by Whitmer as recorded by Heman C. Smith and James Hart. The Smith statement includes a detail that the mob numbered about 500 men, but that Whitmer claimed to boldly testify despite the threats. In the account by Hart, not only was the mob dispersed, but an unnamed doctor was swayed into belief into the Book of Mormon by the power of Whitmer's testimony. I start to find this account pretty suspect, as similar accounts have been demonstrated to have been other than wholly honest or accurate before. Say, for example, the story of Russell M. Nelson's flight with the exploding engine, which has been shown to be an extreme exaggeration of the facts of what actually happened during that flight. Another example of this would be the story that Jeffrey R. Holland shared of the missionary who found his long-lost, drug-addicted brother and brought him back into the church, which turned out to be an inaccurate recounting of events so extreme that the family, who was recounted in the story, requested that the story be retracted. For the purpose of our discussion, we'll go ahead and accept McDonald's contention that Whitmer was of honest and upstanding character. However, it is worth remembering that even those we esteem as being of high character are subject to exaggeration, misremembering, and misrepresentation. That Whitmer was an upstanding and honest member of the community is, for the purpose of our discussion here, accepted. As for David Whitmer's competence, McDonald asserts without qualification that Whitmer had the emotional and intellectual capacity to know whether he was deceived. This is noted previously, especially in our discussion about Oliver Cowdery, is an extremely problematic understanding of how deception works and the nature of people who end up deceived. Plenty of people with ordinary or even tremendous emotional or intellectual capacity end up deceived. As for the consistency of his statements over time, Whitmer's many statements give the most complete portrait of a lifetime of witness testimony, as well as the evolution and potential inconsistencies that emerge over time. For example, in addition to the plates, the Sword of Laban, the Directors, and the Urim and Thummim, David claims that he saw many other records in an 1874 statement. This reference to other records does not appear in the original testimony of the three witnesses, nor in Doctrine and Covenants section 17. There is also the table that appeared with the records on it in the 1874 statement. In an 1883 statement, the angel laid the plates on the table, a small inconsistency to be sure, but worth noting nonetheless. Returning to our discussion about Whitmer's confrontation with the mob, we may see an example of legendary creep in that story that may parallel the evolution of Whitmer's testimony of the plates. Recall that the first version of the account by Green reported that there was a mob, a threat, a testimony, and dispersion. By the end, the mob was 500 men, and the testimony was so powerful that an unnamed bystander was converted to the Book of Mormon. I was unable to uncover any evidence that Isaac Morley, who was the only other person named by Green in his account, had discussed Whitmer's testimony given to the mob. If you're aware of any such statements, I would actually be really interested in kind of exploring this topic a little bit further. With all that said, Whitmer does present a lot of fodder for the historian or the textual critic to chew on, certainly more than any of the other witnesses. For the purposes of our discussion, as with the previous two witnesses, we will just go ahead and accept that Whitmer was largely consistent in his statements. That brings us to what McDonald calls the David Whitmer proposition. It reads, there is large quantities of evidence supporting David's reliability as a witness. Decades of confirmation from non-LDS witnesses to his honesty, to his character, severed relationship with Joseph, and lived among non-believers for most of his life, to his bias, threatened, tarred, feathered, and did not recant, again to his bias. No reasonable evidence for inconsistent statement and many consistent statements, to his status of not giving inconsistent statements over time. No attempt made by critics to attack his mental competency, and abundant evidence of his mental abilities, going to his competency. He concludes, therefore it is reasonable to accept David Whitmer as a reliable witness for his claim, and this is the David Whitmer proposition. The objections to this proposition are not unlike those made about the Oliver Cowdery proposition. Whitmer held a position of some prominence among the saints, even after his excommunication. This indicates a probable source of bias. His competency is under the same sorts of challenges as those facing Cowdery, namely that intellectual and intelligent people are swindled by frauds on a fairly regular basis. Unlike Cowdery, there is a much more complete profile of Whitmer's testimonies, but there does appear to be some legendary creep that merits historical and critical analysis. For our purposes, we are not challenging the consistency of his statements, but we should hold in mind that there is potential to modify that position if new analysis becomes available. Finally, as with both Cowdery and Harris, the nature of the claim is an important factor to consider in just how reliable we can consider a subject to be. I am not sure what would make a person reliable as a witness for artifacts that lack any kind of provenance and other supernatural sightings, but I do not believe the factors under discussion are sufficient to establish the same. Now, before we proceed into a review of the expanding arguments, McDonald takes us on a bit of a detour into a discussion on Joseph Smith's alleged powers of hypnosis. McDonald spends some time going through selected quotes from Brody and Vogel, discussing the possibility that Joseph had induced visions in 3 witness statements. He then introduces a slide that reads as follows. The Harvard Group Scale, HGSS, as the name implies, is administered and predominantly to large groups of people, while the Stanford Hypnotic Susceptibility Scale is administered to individuals. No scale can be seen as completely reliable due to the nature of hypnosis. It has been argued that no person can be hypnotized if they do not want to be. Therefore, a person who scores very low may not want to be hypnotized, making the actual test score averages lower than they otherwise would be. Now, I was curious about the claims made in this unsourced reference, and that search led me to the Wikipedia page for hypnotic susceptibility. It was here that I found this. Go ahead and compare our previous quote to this Wikipedia article. I was rather frustrated with McDonald in the first episode when his definition for evidentialism was word for word the definition of classical foundationalism as found in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and made without reference. This just seems even more egregious to me. I went back to double check if McDonald at least gave a verbal reference to the source of this quote in the video, and he does not. This is bad. But hey, while we're here in this Wikipedia article, why don't we go ahead and look at the attributes of people who are susceptible to hypnosis? I am quoting from the Wikipedia article here, and you can go ahead and even see it on the screen. It tells us that individuals of extremely high hypnotizability tend to have distinctive characteristics outside of hypnosis. In 1981, Cheryl Wilson and T.X. Barber reported that most of a group of extremely high hypnotizables, who they termed fantasizers, exhibited a cluster of traits consisting of 1. Fantasizing much of the time, 2. Reporting their imagery was as vivid as real perceptions, 3. Having physical responses to their imagery, 4. Having an earlier than average age for the first childhood memory, 5. Recalling imaginary playmates from childhood, and 6. Having grown up with parents who encouraged imaginative play. In 1991, Deidre Barrett, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, examined a larger group of extremely high hypnotizables and confirmed that about 60% fit Barber's and Wilson's characterization of fantasizers, while 40% were what she termed dissociators, who 1. Experienced daydreaming mostly as spacing out and not remembering what had been going on for periods of time. 2. Had later than average ages for first memories. And 3. Had parents who had been harshly punitive and or who had experienced other childhood traumas. Fantasizers tended to experience hypnosis as being much like other imaginative activities, while dissociators reported that it was unlike anything that they'd ever experienced. Individuals with dissociative identity disorder have the highest hypnotizability of any clinical group, followed by those with post-traumatic stress disorder. Research has found that transcranial magnetic brain stimulation can enhance hypnotizability. Okay, so that tells us a little bit more about some of the factors that could lead somebody to be highly susceptible to hypnosis. While it would be difficult to confirm whether any of the 3 witnesses met criteria 4 through 6 of the fantasizers, it could very reasonably be argued that they all met the first 3 criteria. I do not think that the evidence is sufficient for determining whether any of them were dissociators, though. I want to be clear. I am not saying that I agree with the hypnosis hypothesis. However, there is some indication that all 3 of the witnesses may have been part of a group that is classified as highly susceptible to hypnotic suggestion. But McDonald makes the point that this is highly unlikely. After all, according to his unsourced numbers, only 10% of the population is highly susceptible. That would make it a 1 in 1,000 chance that all of these men were highly susceptible. How could Joseph have possibly gotten so lucky? Well, ignoring that unlikely events happen all the time, let's instead look at the fact that McDonald does not understand how to apply probabilities. You see, the 1 in 1,000 figure only works if the 3 men were randomly selected. If you have a bag of marbles where only 1 in 10 are blue, and you select 3 blue ones at random in a row, let's say the bag holds many thousands of marbles, then those odds are 1 in 1,000. But if blue marbles happen to associate with other blue marbles, and you ran in the same social circles as those other blue marbles, then the odds are a hell of a lot better that you would find 3 blue marbles. Okay, so the analogy fell apart a bit on me there, but I hope that this gets the point across. Joseph is not just randomly picking 3 people and getting their testimony of the plates. If he had, then the witness statements would actually be an interesting piece of evidence for critical examination. But the witnesses are the sorts of people that Joseph, a person with a magical worldview, would associate with, as evidenced by his association with them. And they were not at all randomly selected. These were curated choices. McDonald argues that there is no way to know if any of the witnesses were in the highly susceptible group, and I agree with him about that, mostly. But in the same Wikipedia article that he plagiarized, there are some criteria that we can look at to see if we can find some hints or indications that they were. And by my estimation, it does appear rather likely that they were part of the highly susceptible population. McDonald then argues that there are other problems with the hypnosis hypothesis. I may be inclined to agree with him, as it is not a hypothesis that I would elevate beyond being one possible explanation among possible explanations. That said, it is worth going through McDonald's reasons to see if they are good ones for disqualifying the hypnosis hypothesis. His first contention is that the idea of hypnosis is anachronistic. He argues that because the idea of medical hypnosis did not appear in a written report until 1831, and that stage hypnosis had its first reported use in 1829, that hypnosis just isn't something that Joseph would have had the ability to even know to do. Unfortunately, I find the argumentation here to be like arguing that same-sex sexual activity didn't exist until 1868 because the word homosexual hadn't been coined yet. That's a date that I went ahead and confirmed on Wikipedia's article, The History of Homosexuality, by the way, just to reference my source. This would be a poor argument to make. Altered mental states existed long before 1829. Charismatic movements like early Mormonism created them all the time as part of their religious worship. You can see similar occurrences of people en masse experiencing altered mental states when you watch footage of Pentecostal revivals and sermons today. It may be that Brodie used an anachronistic term in her description of Joseph's own proposed ability to induce altered mental states, but the phenomenon itself was not anachronistic in the slightest. The second problem from McDonald's perspective is that the induction of altered mental states, like hypnosis, require willing participants. He provides two quotes that affirm this point, but he does not deal with the elephant in the room. The witnesses were most probably quite willing. There had been all sorts of lead up and promises. This was something that they wanted to see. This was something that they wanted to experience. And when the time came, there was a bit of a hiccup with Martin Harris, but they saw. Is this just willing participants being led into the hypnotic trance? Well, McDonald has failed to indicate otherwise. For the third problem, McDonald discusses challenges associated with mass hallucinations. To this, I will again point our eye back to that October day in 1917 in Fatima, Portugal. It was a day that the three shepherd children had promised and had even suffered for their promise, that a manifestation of the Virgin Mary would be made known to the people. And there were thousands who saw the sun dance in the sky. A much more impressive feat than that of getting three motivated men to see an angel and some artifacts. Wouldn't you agree? And yet, I don't believe the people at Fatima have a correct interpretation of their experience. I do not believe that their claimed experience was an actual manifestation of the power of the Virgin Mary. And based on how the algorithm works and who this video is likely shown to, I honestly doubt that you believe those ideas either. Problem the fourth is about inducing a hypnotic experience without the person realizing it, but making the experience last a lifetime. McDonald defends this with a quote about post-hypnotic suggestion that seems irrelevant. I don't really know what he was trying to do with this one. Seems pointless, and I'm moving on. The fifth problem that McDonald sees is that Joseph only used this power to create the Book of Mormon witnesses. Why wouldn't he have done it for other things? From a critical perspective, this point is pretty laughable. The history of early Mormonism is rife with reports of visions, angels, and all sorts of excitement that comes with charismatic movements. A person who holds to the hypnosis hypothesis does not contend that the practice started and ended with the Book of Mormon witnesses. It became a pattern from which much of Joseph's ministry was built. McDonald concludes his diversion to Joseph's power of hypnosis with the following summary. 1. Brodie uses no sources and Vogel uses only 4 as evidence for subjective trance experience. And then he lists these sources, all from Martin Harris. 2. These sources are contradicted by more than 100 contradicting statements by the supposed victims. 3. No evidence is offered for how Joseph learned or trained hypnosis prior to the word being invented and prior to the rise of hypnotherapy in Europe. 4. No evidence is offered for Joseph ever trying, failing, to hypnotize anyone. 5. No evidence is offered for the ability of any trained hypnotist to induce similar experience. And 6. Prior to shifting the burden of proof to apologists, critics must offer reasonable evidence for the above. All right, I am not interested in litigating the source documents that Brodie or Vogel use in their claims. They can defend that hypnosis hypothesis in their own way, and Vogel is welcome to defend his position or not. The first 2 points are therefore of no real interest to me when discussing this diversion. However, points 3 through 6 are worth looking at because they show us a glimpse into how McDonald deals with critical arguments. In 3, he contends that there is no evidence that Joseph learned or trained in hypnosis prior to the word being invented and prior to the rise of hypnotherapy. This shows a clear, arguably intentional, misunderstanding of the arguments made by Brodie and Vogel. If he was interested in having a more charitable and accurate understanding of the critical argument, he might instead discuss whether there was evidence of Joseph learning how altered mental states could be induced, say, from his time as a Methodist exhorter, or just from hanging out around all of the revivals that were going on. This is a much less salient point once we take a looser interpretation of the use of the word hypnosis as employed by Brody, rather than trying to be pedantic to the point of intentionally failing to understand the opposition. In 4, he argues that there is no evidence of Joseph ever trying to hypnotize anyone. One could argue that there is actually an abundance of the same, ranging from how he would engage in his treasure-seeking behaviors to the visionary experiences that seem to follow in his wake throughout his ministry. In this model, the hypnosis of the witnesses becomes part of a pattern, not an anomaly. For 5, he contends that no trained hypnotist appears able to do what Joseph could do. I just need to turn on TBN to see examples of people doing the same thing today. In his last point, McDonald argues that critics need to offer reasonable answers to his conclusion before shifting the burden of proof to apologists. This shows a clear misunderstanding of how the burden of proof works. The burden of proof is held by the person making the positive claim. Therefore, if a critic makes the positive claim that Joseph used hypnosis to induce vision in the witnesses, then sure, they would have the burden of proof for that. However, if the apologist wants to make the positive claim that the witnesses actually saw a real angel with real plates and a real sword of a real Laban and all the other things that they claim to have seen, the burden of proof doesn't magically shift back to the critic because the hypnosis hypothesis hasn't been adequately accounted for, because that's not how any of this works. If you make the claim, you have the burden of proof. The whole point of this series is supposed to be to make the positive case for LDS truth claims. That means the ball and the burden of proof is in your court, Brett. And you know this because you have a degree in philosophy, right? Okay, let's just get into the arguments now with the David Whitmer proposition added in. Argument 1 now reads pretty much the same as before, with premises A through D the same as they were with the Oliver Cowdery editions. We've now added in premise E. David Whitmer's testimony of the angel and plates is reliable. This from the David Whitmer proposition. The conclusion remains the same as before. You may have to go back a few minutes in this video now to recall what we actually discussed with the David Whitmer proposition. But we did find it to be insufficient for establishing David Whitmer as reliable for a claim of this nature. The same structural issues as before are still present in this argument, and it remains as both invalid and unsound. Argument number 2 is getting a lot more points added here. Premises A through D have remained unchanged. Premise E is altered to state that Joseph Smith induces a hypnotic trance for Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, and then separately for Martin Harris of identical visions. Premise F now reads, Joseph Smith induces hypnotic trance without his presence for Mary Whitmer, Sarah Pulsifer, Harrison Burgess, and Luke Johnson, at the very least. Premise G is now Joseph Smith induces complex audiovisual visions that are specific and experienced in the same manner in contravention of known hypnotherapy. Premise H now reads, Joseph Smith induces these hypnotic trances prior to the rise of hypnotic research, which was in the 1840s, and in a location, rural New York, where no evidence of such knowledge existed. He may have even done so unknowingly. Premise I is now, the hallucination is so effective for Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and others that it endures for the rest of their lives despite no relationship and much ridicule. Premises J through M are the same as they were when we were discussing Oliver Cowdery. Premise N now reads that it is highly improbable that Joseph Smith could have accomplished B through M, and the conclusion remains the same. It is reasonable, probable that Joseph Smith possessed plates as he claimed. So some of the premises have been shifted around, as noted since our last episode, and hopefully the changes are clear in this presentation. We're going to go ahead and go through what has been altered to reevaluate the argument. As noted before, premises A through D are unchanged, and so they retain the same status. Premise E is largely just an alteration of an earlier premise. The question that I have here is, did all three of these witnesses have identical visions? I don't believe that that's actually in evidence. All three were willing to sign a statement claiming to see the plates, engravings, and an angel. Doctrine and Covenants section 17 mentions that they would also see the sword of Laban, the directors, the interpreters, and the breastplate, but these are left out of the official testimony. Could it be that only Whitmer saw those things? I don't recall McDonald showing a statement from Harris or Cowdery that included these other artifacts. And what about the table and the other records? Did Cowdery see those as well? Where did he say as much? And what about Harris? This point may be flat out wrong. if not merely unsubstantiated. But I am willing just to rank it as unsubstantiated or as a straw man of a supposed critical position at present. Premise F is certainly a straw man argument. That these other people claimed visions at later dates is not a sign that they were ever under a trance or actually had such an experience. That enthusiastic new converts claim to have tremendous revelatory experience is not surprising or an indication that their claims are accurate reflections of reality. Therefore, a reasonable critic would not make this argument, making this premise a straw man. It is also immaterial to whether Joseph actually possessed plates, making this a red herring. Premise G is another straw man mixed in with what has been an ongoing equivocation fallacy. Basically, McDonald is using Brody's use of the word hypnosis and Vogel's use of the term induced trance or induced vision to be the same thing as hypnosis in a clinical or performative sense. They are not using the term that way, making this argument for McDonald further fallacious. This trend is continued in premise H. We've already discussed Joseph's powers of hypnosis, and I'm not going to relitigate those points here. Premises G and H both lose their force when we consider that McDonald is employing an equivocation fallacy to bolster a straw man. Premise I is an alteration of the earlier premise about Martin Harris' half-long century testimony. It is evaluated along the same lines as that earlier version, where the issues of no relationship and much ridicule are questionable at best. McDonald's argument would be better served by taking a more robust and period-accurate understanding of Mormonism and who these people were to the early saints. And as noted before, premises J through M remain unchanged from last time. Argument number 2 remains invalid and unsound. I was getting to the point where I was beginning to feel charitable towards McDonald and his approach. As I've mentioned, I really do appreciate the way that he is approaching this series through building upon arguments step by step as we work our way through everything. This allows us to evaluate the pieces of the argument as it gets built to see if we eventually arrive at something both valid and sound to at least a preponderance standard. However, the quite blatant plagiarism of Wikipedia is rather egregious, especially in light of my earlier criticisms from the very first episode. It is okay to quote Wikipedia, and I understand that this is not an academic setting. But taking that much direct text without citation should not be considered an acceptable behavior. It just erodes trust when it comes to the later points. Next time, we're going to wrap up our discussion of the witnesses with the 8 witnesses. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all of the fun YouTube things, and I'll see you in the next one.